The morning light from Kepler Station's artificial sun streamed through the tall windows of Lecture Hall 7. Students from across the galaxy sat in neat rows, their different body shapes and sizes making the room look like a strange collection of alien creatures. Some had blue skin, others had scales, and a few had tentacles instead of arms. But they all wore the same dark blue uniforms of the Galactic Naval Academy. Professor Veltar stood at the front of the room, his tall, thin frame casting a long shadow. His gray skin had the texture of old leather, and his forearms moved gracefully as he spoke. As an Altarian, he had lived for over 300 years and had seen many wars across the galaxy. His voice was deep and calm as he talked about military history. "Today we will discuss the battle tactics of different species," he said, pointing to a large screen behind him. "Each race has developed unique ways of fighting based on their natural abilities and cultural values." The students listened carefully, taking notes on their datapads. Most of them came from powerful military families and planned to become officers in their home fleets. They had studied the great battles of the past and knew the names of famous generals from many worlds. In the third row, a young woman with short brown hair sat quietly. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was the only human in the class. She was part of a new exchange program, since humanity had only joined the galactic community 5 years ago. The other students often stared at her, curious about this new species that claimed to come from a small blue planet on the edge of known space. Most of the alien students thought humans were primitive. Earth had no great space fleets or advanced weapons. Human technology was hundreds of years behind the rest of the galaxy. Their planet had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel with help from alien visitors. To many in the class, humans seemed like children playing at being soldiers. Beltar continued his lecture, showing images of famous battles on the screen. "The Zephyrians won the Battle of Crimson Nebula through superior planning," he explained. "They calculated every move 3 steps ahead and suffered only 2% casualties while destroying an entire enemy fleet." A student in the front row raised his hand. His name was Kethvar, a young Zephyrian with pale blue skin and silver eyes. His species was known across the galaxy for being excellent at military strategy. Zephyrian generals were hired by many governments because they almost never lost a battle. "Professor," Kethvar said with a confident smile, "I have studied the military records of many species. Each one has clear strengths and weaknesses that can be measured and compared. But I noticed something strange in our database." Veltar nodded for him to continue. The other students turned to listen, always interested when Kethvar spoke. He was the top student in their class and came from a family of famous military leaders. "We have detailed casualty rates for every major species," Kethvar continued. "The Altarians average 8% casualties per engagement. The Drachmoth suffer 12%. Even the warrior clans of Gorath rarely exceed 15%. But there is one species whose data seems to be missing or corrupted." He paused for effect, enjoying the attention of his classmates. His silver eyes gleamed with amusement as he looked around the room. "I wonder," he said slowly, "if anyone here knows what the casualty rate of an Earth Marine is?" Several students chuckled softly. The question was clearly meant to embarrass the human student sitting in the third row. Everyone knew that humans were new to space warfare and probably had terrible military records. It was a cruel joke disguised as an academic question. Sarah Chen felt her face grow warm as dozens of alien eyes turned to look at her. She had heard whispers in the halls about how humans were weak and backward. Some students called her people the soft ones because they had no natural armor or claws. Others joked that humans would run away at the first sign of real fighting. She wanted to defend her people, but she did not know the exact numbers that Kethvar was asking about. Sarah had served briefly in the Earth Defense Forces before coming to the Academy, but she had never seen major combat. She knew human soldiers were brave and determined, but she could not quote statistics to prove it. "Well," Kethvar pressed, his smile growing wider, "surely our human classmate knows something about her own species' military performance." The room grew quiet. Even Professor Veltar seemed interested in the answer. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. She felt trapped and alone, surrounded by alien faces that expected her to admit human weakness. But before she could say anything, Professor Veltar raised one of his 4 hands for silence. "That is an excellent question, Cadet Kethvar," the professor said thoughtfully, "and I realize that I do not know the answer either. Human military data is still being integrated into our databases, and much of it remains classified or improperly formatted. The old Altarian walked slowly across the front of the room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. His expression had changed from casual interest to serious curiosity. In fact, he continued, this presents us with a perfect research opportunity. Rather than speculating or making assumptions, we should investigate the matter properly. Good military officers base their decisions on accurate information, not on rumors or prejudice. Kethvar looked slightly disappointed that his joke had not worked as planned. Of course, Professor. I simply thought it would be interesting to compare human performance to established galactic standards. Indeed it would, Veltar agreed, and we shall do exactly that. I will spend the next few days researching human military records and casualty reports. When I have gathered sufficient data, I will present my findings to the class. He turned to face all the students, his ancient eyes serious and thoughtful. This will serve as a lesson for all of you, he said. A good officer never makes assumptions about enemy capabilities based on appearance or reputation. Every species has evolved different strengths and weaknesses. What looks like a disadvantage might actually be a hidden strength. The professor glanced at Sarah, and she thought she saw something like kindness in his alien features. Class dismissed, Veltar announced. Please read chapters 12 through 15 for tomorrow's discussion on siege warfare tactics. The students began packing their datapads and filing out of the room. Several of them looked at Sarah with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Kithvar passed by her seat and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. I look forward to learning about human military. Excellence, he said with obvious sarcasm. Sarah watched him leave with his group of friends, all of them laughing quietly about something. She felt angry and embarrassed, but also worried. What if the professor found records that really did make humans look weak and incompetent? What if Kethvar was right to mock her people? As she gathered her things, Sarah noticed that Professor Veltar was still standing at the front of the room, staring at the blank screen with a thoughtful expression. For some reason, the old alien seemed genuinely interested in finding the answer to Kethvar's question. She hoped that whatever he found would not make things worse for her or for humanity's reputation in the galaxy. But deep down, Sarah had a feeling that the answer might surprise everyone in ways they could never expect. Professor Veltar sat in his private office 3 levels below the main academy building. The room was dimly lit, with soft blue light coming from several data screens that covered the walls. As an Altarian, he could see clearly in low light, and the darkness helped him focus on complex research. For the past 2 days, he had been trying to access human military records. The task was proving more difficult than he had expected. Human data systems were still being connected to the galactic network, and many files required special permission to view. Some records were written in old Earth languages that the translation programs could not handle properly. Veltar had lived through many wars and studied the military history of dozens of species. He had seen the rise and fall of great empires across the galaxy. In all his years of research, he had never encountered a species whose basic military data was so hard to find. At first, he assumed this was because humans were new to galactic society. Their technology was primitive, and their record-keeping systems were probably disorganized. He expected to find evidence of poor leadership, outdated tactics, and high casualty rates that would explain why Earth had such a small military presence in space. But as he dug deeper into the available files, strange patterns began to emerge. The first thing that confused him was the organization of human military forces. Most galactic species had huge armies with millions of soldiers. The Zephyrian Empire could field over 50 million troops across their territory. The Drachmoth war clans had nearly 100 million warriors ready for battle at any time. Humans, however, had only a few million soldiers total for their entire planet. For a world with over 8 billion people, this seemed impossibly small. Either humans were completely peaceful, or they had some other way of defending themselves that Veltar did not understand. The second strange thing was how human military units were named and organized. Other species had clear hierarchies, with simple names like 1st Battle Fleet or 7th Infantry Legion. Human units had confusing titles like Marine Expeditionary Force and Special Operations Command that did not fit standard galactic military categories. But the most puzzling discovery was in the casualty reports themselves. Veltar had finally managed to access several human battle records from their recent conflicts on Earth. He expected to see the usual statistics that every military force tracked: soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in action. These numbers were used across the galaxy to measure the effectiveness of different armies and tactics. What he found instead made no sense at all. According to the data, human casualty rates in some battles exceeded 300%. In a few extreme cases, the numbers went even higher. One unit called 2nd Battalion 3rd Marines reported 450% casualties during something called the Battle of Fallujah. Veltar stared at the screen in confusion. How could any military unit have casualties that exceeded 100%? Once every soldier in a unit was killed or wounded, there should be no one left to fight. The mathematics simply did not work. His first thought was that human record-keeping was even worse than he had imagined. Perhaps they were counting the same casualties multiple times, or maybe their translation programs were converting the numbers incorrectly. He tried accessing the raw data files, but the results were the same. Growing frustrated, Veltar decided to focus on a single human conflict to see if he could understand their system better. He chose something called World War II, which seemed to be a major planetary war that happened about 80 years ago. Surely a conflict that large would have clear, understandable casualty figures. The results were even more confusing. An entire human army group called the Pacific Marine Corps had reported over 200% casualties during a campaign that lasted several years. Individual units within that force showed even higher numbers. Some Marine battalions had casualty rates exceeding 500%, while still continuing to fight effectively. Veltar leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples with two of his 4 hands. In over 3 centuries of military study, he had never encountered anything like this. Either human mathematics was completely different from galactic standards, or something very strange was happening with their military forces. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking at the numbers, he would read the actual battle reports to see what had really happened during these conflicts. The first report he opened described a battle on a place called Iwo Jima. A human marine unit had landed on a small island defended by enemy forces. The fighting lasted for several weeks, with the Marines slowly advancing across difficult terrain while under constant attack. As Veltar read the detailed accounts, he began to notice something unusual. The same Marine units appeared in casualty reports multiple times during the same battle. Soldiers who were listed as wounded in action on one day would appear again in combat reports a few days later. Some names showed up in casualty lists 3 or 4 times during a single engagement. At first, he thought this was another example of poor human record-keeping, but as he read more carefully, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Marines who were reported as casualties were not actually dead or permanently disabled. They had been wounded, treated by medical personnel, and then returned to combat. Some soldiers had been wounded multiple times during the same battle and continued fighting after each injury. Veltar felt a cold sensation in his stomach as he realized what this might mean. He opened another battle report, this one from a conflict called the Korean War. The pattern was the same. Human soldiers were wounded, healed, and returned to fight again and again until they were either killed or too badly injured to continue. He spent the next several hours reading through dozens of human military reports. Every conflict showed the same impossible statistics. Marine units with casualty rates over 300% were not unusual. They were normal. In galactic warfare, when a soldier was wounded badly enough to be removed from combat, they stayed removed. Most species had medical technology that could heal injuries, but the psychological trauma of being hurt in battle usually meant that soldiers could not return to fighting for months or years, if ever. Humans seemed to be different. According to the reports, human soldiers regularly returned to combat within days or even hours of being wounded. Some had fought with broken bones, severe burns, or blood loss that would incapacitate any other known species. They continued fighting until their bodies physically could not function anymore. Veltar stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the stars beyond Kepler Station. For the first time in his long life, he felt genuinely disturbed by what he had learned. The casualty rates that had seemed like evidence of human incompetence were actually something much more frightening. He was beginning to understand. that humans might be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, but he needed more information before he could be certain. Tomorrow he would dig deeper into human physiology and psychology to understand how this was possible. The answer to Cadet Kethavar's simple question was turning out to be far more complex than anyone had imagined, and far more terrifying. Professor Veltar had not slept well. The human military records he had studied the previous day kept running through his mind like a disturbing dream. He arrived at his office early, determined to understand what made human soldiers so different from every other species in the galaxy. He began by accessing the Galactic Medical Database, searching for information about human biology and physiology. What he found made the puzzle even more confusing. According to the medical scans that had been done when humans first joined the galactic community, they were actually one of the weakest species ever discovered. Human bones were thin and brittle compared to most aliens. Their skin offered almost no protection against weapons or environmental hazards. They had no natural armor, claws, or defensive capabilities. Human muscles were also relatively weak. The average human could lift only about half as much as a Zephyrian of similar size. They were slower than most species, could not see as well in the dark, and had poor hearing compared to galactic standards. By every physical measurement, humans should have been terrible soldiers. Yet somehow, these weak and fragile creatures had casualty rates that defied all logic. Veltar decided to focus on human medical records from their military conflicts. If human soldiers were being wounded and returning to fight multiple times, there had to be something unusual about how their bodies healed or how they responded to injury. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about human biology. The first clue was in something called adrenaline. Human bodies naturally produced a chemical substance that other species only encountered as an illegal combat drug. When humans were injured or frightened, their systems would flood with this substance, allowing them to ignore pain and continue functioning despite severe damage. Veltar had seen adrenaline used by soldiers from other species, and it was always considered dangerous. Too much adrenaline could cause heart failure or permanent brain damage. Most military forces banned its use except in extreme emergencies, but humans produced adrenaline automatically whenever they faced danger. Their bodies were designed to operate on what other species considered a dangerous combat stimulant. This explained how human soldiers could continue fighting with injuries that would incapacitate anyone else. The second discovery was even more disturbing. Human healing rates were far beyond what the initial medical scans had suggested. While their bodies seemed fragile, they could recover from injuries with shocking speed. Broken bones that would take other species months to heal properly would mend in humans within weeks. More importantly, humans seemed to have an unusual relationship with pain and trauma. The medical records showed that human soldiers who had been severely wounded often requested to return to combat as soon as they could walk. This was unheard of in galactic military forces. Veltar found a detailed study that had been done by human military doctors during one of their wars. The report analyzed something called combat effectiveness among wounded soldiers who had returned to duty. The results were frightening. Human soldiers who had been wounded and healed actually performed better in subsequent battles than those who had never been injured. They were calmer under fire, made better decisions, and showed improved teamwork with their units. Instead of being traumatized by combat injuries, humans seemed to be strengthened by them. The professor sat back in his chair, feeling a chill run down his spine. Every other species in the galaxy became less effective after being wounded in battle. The psychological impact of injury and pain made soldiers cautious and hesitant. Many never returned to combat duty at all. Humans were the opposite. They became more dangerous each time they were hurt, but there was still more to discover. Veltar accessed human training records to see how their military prepared soldiers for combat. What he found was unlike anything he had ever seen. Human military training was designed around the assumption that soldiers would be wounded multiple times during their careers. They practiced fighting with simulated injuries, learned to operate weapons while exhausted or in pain, and trained extensively in battlefield medicine so they could treat each other during combat. Most alien military forces focused on avoiding casualties and minimizing risks to their soldiers. Human training seemed designed to prepare soldiers for being hurt repeatedly and continuing to fight anyway. Veltar found video records of human training exercises and watched them with growing amazement. Human soldiers would run for miles while carrying heavy equipment, fight hand-to-hand combat until they were bruised and bleeding, and practice tactical maneuvers under conditions that would be considered torture by galactic standards. What shocked him most was that the humans seemed to enjoy this brutal training. They competed with each other to see who could endure the most punishment, and they celebrated soldiers who pushed themselves beyond normal physical limits. In one video, Veltar watched a human marine unit completing something called the Crucible, a final test that lasted for several days without sleep or adequate food. The soldiers were required to march long distances, solve tactical problems, and work as a team while exhausted and hungry. At the end of the test, instead of collapsing or complaining, the humans celebrated. They were proud of what they had endured. They bonded with each other through shared suffering in a way that no other species would understand. Veltar paused the video and stared at the screen. The young human Marines looked tired and dirty, but their eyes were bright with determination and pride. They had voluntarily subjected themselves to conditions that would break most alien soldiers, and they had emerged stronger for it. He began to understand why human casualty rates were so high. It was not because their leaders were incompetent or their tactics were poor. It was because human soldiers were literally designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Their bodies, their minds, and their culture all supported this incredible ability to endure and overcome physical damage. But there was one more piece of the puzzle that Veltar needed to understand. He accessed psychological profiles of human soldiers to see what motivated them to continue fighting through such terrible conditions. The answer was found in something humans called unit cohesion. Human soldiers did not fight primarily for their government or their cause, though those things mattered. They fought for each other. The bonds between human soldiers were stronger than anything seen in other species. When a human Marine was wounded, their primary concern was not their own pain or safety. They worried about letting down their fellow soldiers. They wanted to return to combat as quickly as possible because they felt responsible for protecting their unit. This created a feedback loop that made human military forces incredibly resilient. Soldiers would endure terrible injuries to avoid abandoning their friends. They would return to combat while still healing because they felt guilty about being safe, while their unit remained in danger. Veltar found reports of human soldiers who had fought with broken arms, severe burns, and internal injuries that should have killed them. They continued fighting not because they were forced to, but because they refused to leave their fellow Marines behind. The professor stood up and walked to his window again, looking out at the peaceful stars. He now understood the true meaning of those impossible casualty statistics. A human Marine unit with 300% casualties meant that every soldier in the unit had been wounded and returned to fight at least 3 times. They were not poor soldiers with bad leadership. They were the most effective and terrifying military force the galaxy had ever seen. They just measured success differently than everyone else. Tomorrow he would have to explain this to his class. He would have to tell Cadet Kethvar and the other students that their simple question about human weakness had revealed something that would change how the galaxy viewed warfare forever. Veltar suspected that after tomorrow, no one would ever underestimate humans again. Professor Veltar spent his 3rd day of research diving into the darkest corners of human military history. What he had learned about their biology and psychology was disturbing enough, but he needed to understand the full implications of what these capabilities meant for galactic security. He started by examining human conflicts that had occurred before they joined the galactic community. If humans were as dangerous as his research suggested, their own history should show evidence of it. What he found exceeded his worst fears. Human military conflicts were unlike anything else in the known galaxy. Most species fought wars to gain territory, resources, or political control. When the cost became too high, they would negotiate peace and find diplomatic solutions. War was seen as an extension of politics, a tool to be used carefully and abandoned when it became too expensive. Humans fought differently. Veltar studied something called World War I, a conflict that had lasted 4 years and killed millions of human soldiers. The battles were fought in conditions that would have caused any other species to surrender immediately. Soldiers lived in muddy trenches, surrounded by poison gas and constant artillery bombardment. Disease and starvation were common, But instead of seeking peace, humans adapted. They developed new weapons, new tactics, and new ways to survive in impossible conditions. They continued fighting for years in situations that should have broken their will to resist within weeks. The casualty numbers from this conflict were staggering. Some human battles resulted in hundreds of thousands of wounded or dead soldiers in a single day. Yet the armies continued fighting. New soldiers replaced the fallen ones, and the war continued for years. What shocked Veltar most was that this was not unusual in human history. They had fought dozens of similar conflicts, each one lasting years and causing massive casualties. Humans seemed to view such suffering as normal and acceptable. He found records of a battle called the Somme, where human armies suffered over 1 million casualties in 5 months of fighting. Any other species would have considered this a catastrophic defeat that ended their military capability. For humans, it was just another chapter in a longer war. But the most disturbing discovery came when Veltar examined how human civilians responded to these massive military casualties. Instead of demanding peace, they supported the war effort even more strongly. Families who lost sons in battle would send their remaining children to fight. Entire populations would work in factories to build weapons, even when their cities were being bombed by enemy forces. Veltar found propaganda posters from human wars that showed this mentality clearly. Images of human families proudly sending their children off to die in foreign lands. Slogans encouraging citizens to sacrifice everything for victory. Civilians celebrating soldiers who had been wounded multiple times in combat. Other species fought wars with their military forces while trying to protect their civilian populations from harm. Humans turned their entire societies into war machines, with every citizen contributing to the conflict regardless of personal cost. This led Veltar to a terrifying realization about human military doctrine. The casualty rates he had been studying were not accidents or the result of poor planning. They were intentional. Human military leaders expected their soldiers to be wounded and return to fight multiple times. They planned operations around the assumption that units would take massive casualties and continue functioning. Their logistics systems were designed to replace wounded soldiers quickly and efficiently. Most galactic military forces tried to minimize casualties because replacing trained soldiers was expensive and time-consuming. Humans had solved this problem by making their soldiers nearly impossible to permanently disable. They could be wounded, healed, and returned to combat repeatedly until they achieved their objectives. Veltar accessed tactical manuals from human military academies to see how they taught these concepts to their officers. What he found was a completely alien approach to warfare that prioritized mission accomplishment over soldier survival. Human officers were trained to accept that their soldiers would be hurt, potentially many times during any significant operation. They learned to calculate casualty rates not as failures to be avoided, but as operational costs to be managed. A human general planning an assault would factor in the assumption that his forces would take 2 or 300% casualties and still complete their mission. This was fundamentally different from how every other species approached military planning. Zephyrian generals tried to achieve victory with minimal losses. Drachmoth war chiefs sought to overwhelm enemies quickly to avoid prolonged fighting. Altarian commanders used technology and superior positioning to reduce risks to their forces. Humans planned for maximum casualties and simply accepted them as the price of victory. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of human military thinking was how they viewed death itself. Veltar found numerous examples of human soldiers who had sacrificed their lives to save their units or accomplish mission objectives. These individuals were not mourned as tragic losses. They were celebrated as heroes. Human military culture actually encouraged soldiers to die for their cause if necessary. They trained extensively in tactics that required individual soldiers to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the group. Humans had weapons specifically designed to be used by soldiers who did not expect to survive the mission. Veltar studied records of human suicide attacks and found that they were far more common and effective than similar tactics used by other species. Human soldiers could be counted on to carry out missions that meant certain death, and they would do so willingly if they believed it would help their fellow Marines. This level of dedication was unheard of in galactic military forces. Most soldiers fought bravely, but they expected to survive their service and return home. Humans seemed to view military service as something worth dying for, regardless of the specific conflict or political situation. The professor began to understand why Earth had such a small military relative to its population. They did not need massive armies because each individual soldier was exponentially more effective than troops from other species. A single human marine unit could potentially fight with the effectiveness of 3 or 4 alien units, simply because they could absorb punishment that would destroy other forces. More disturbing still, Feltar realized that humans had not yet fought a war against alien opponents. All of their casualty statistics and tactical doctrine had been developed while fighting other humans. Their enemies had been equally tough, equally determined, and equally capable of enduring massive losses. What would happen when humans fought against alien forces that could not match their ability to absorb casualties and continue fighting? What would happen when human Marines encountered enemies who would surrender or retreat when faced with the kind of punishment that humans considered routine? Feltar sat in his darkened office, staring at the data screens that surrounded him. For 3 days, he had been researching what he thought would be a simple question about military statistics. Instead, he had uncovered evidence that humanity might be the most dangerous military force the galaxy had ever encountered, and they did not even realize it yet. The humans who had joined the galactic community seemed to view themselves as a peaceful species. They had small military forces and appeared to prefer diplomatic solutions to conflicts. But Feltar now understood that this was only because they had no serious enemies to fight. If humans ever decided that galactic peace was not in their interest, or if they were threatened by other species, they possessed the capability to wage war in ways that would terrify every civilization in known space. Tomorrow, he would have to explain this to a classroom full of alien cadets who still thought humans were weak and primitive. He would have to tell them that their assumptions about Earth's military capabilities were not just wrong, they were dangerously naive. The casualty rate of an Earth Marine was about to become the most important statistic in galactic military history. The lecture hall was more crowded than usual. Word had spread through the academy that Professor Feltar would finally answer Cadet Kethavar's question about human military casualties. Students from other classes had come to hear what they expected would be an amusing discussion about human military failures. Sarah Chen sat in her usual seat in the 3rd row, feeling nervous and uncomfortable. For 3 days she had endured whispered comments and knowing looks from her classmates. Everyone seemed to expect that today would bring embarrassing revelations about human military incompetence. Kethavar sat in the front row with his usual confident smile. He had been telling other students that Professor Feltar's research would finally prove what everyone already knew, that humans were too weak and primitive to be effective soldiers. Several of his friends had made bets about how bad the human casualty numbers would be. Professor Feltar entered the room looking older and more tired than Sarah had ever seen him. His usually perfect posture was slightly bent, and his forearms moved slowly as he arranged his materials at the front of the class. The cheerful demeanor he normally displayed was replaced by a serious, almost grim expression. He stood silently for several moments, looking out at the expectant faces of his students. The room gradually grew quiet as everyone realized that something was different about their professor's mood. 3 days ago, Feltar began, his voice unusually quiet. Cadet Kethavar asked what seemed like a simple question about human military casualties. I assumed it would be easy to answer using standard galactic military databases. He paused, touching a control that brought up a large display screen behind him. The screen showed a single line of text. Casualty rate Earth Marines 314%. Several students chuckled, assuming this was a joke or a mistake. Kethavar laughed out loud and turned to his friends with a triumphant expression. As you can see, Kethavar called out, human record keeping is even worse than we thought. They cannot even calculate percentages correctly. But Professor Feltar did not smile. Instead, he looked directly at the young Zephyrian with an expression that made Kethavar's laughter die in his throat. The number is correct, Feltar said quietly. 314% casualties. That is the average casualty rate for Earth Marine units across all major conflicts in their recent history. The room fell silent. Students looked at each other in confusion, unsure whether the professor was serious or setting up some kind of elaborate joke. Professor, said a Drachmoth student from the back of the room, that is mathematically impossible. No unit can have casualties exceeding 100%. Once every soldier is dead or wounded, there is no one left to fight. Veltar nodded slowly. That is what I thought as well. It is what any rational military analyst would think. But I spent 3 days researching human military records, and I can assure you that the number is both accurate and terrifying. He touched another control, and the screen filled with data from human battles. Names, dates, and casualty figures scrolled past in endless columns. The reason human casualty rates exceed 100%, Veltar continued, is that humans do not stop fighting when they are wounded. They are treated, healed, and returned to combat. The average human Marine will be wounded severely enough to be considered a casualty by galactic standards over 3 times before they are permanently removed from combat operations. A female student from the Altarian delegation raised her hand. But, Professor, if soldiers are wounded that badly, surely they cannot fight effectively afterward. The psychological trauma alone should incapacitate them. Veltar's expression grew even more grim. That is what I expected to find as well. But human psychology is unlike anything else in the galaxy. Wounded human soldiers actually become more effective fighters after they recover. They are calmer under fire, make better tactical decisions, and show improved unit cohesion. He brought up medical records on the screen, showing injury reports and recovery times that made several students gasp in shock. Human bodies produce a natural combat stimulant called adrenaline that would be considered an illegal military drug if used by any other species. They heal from injuries at rates that exceed galactic medical standards. Most importantly, they possess a psychological makeup that allows them to not only endure repeated trauma, but to be strengthened by it. Kethvar stood up abruptly, his silver eyes wide with disbelief. Professor, this is impossible. Humans are weak. They have no natural armor, no claws, no defensive capabilities. They are primitive compared to every other galactic species. Veltar looked at the young Zephyrian with what might have been pity. Yes, Cadet Kethvar, humans are physically weak by galactic standards. That is precisely what makes them so dangerous. The professor brought up video footage from human training exercises, showing Marines enduring conditions that made many of the alien students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Human military doctrine is built around the assumption that soldiers will be wounded multiple times during their careers. They train extensively to fight while injured, exhausted, or in pain. Their logistic systems are designed to rapidly treat and return wounded soldiers to combat. Their culture celebrates individuals who sacrifice themselves for their unit's success. Sarah Chen felt a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment as she watched her classmates' reactions. The casual conversations and dismissive jokes had stopped completely. Students were staring at the screen with expressions ranging from amazement to horror. Consider the implications, Veltar continued. Human Marines expect to be wounded repeatedly and continue fighting. Their enemies expect the same thing. Every human conflict has been fought between forces that could absorb massive casualties and keep fighting for years. He paused to let this sink in before delivering his final point. Humans have never fought a war against an enemy that would surrender after taking normal galactic casualty rates of 10 or 15%. They have no experience fighting opponents who view military service as something to survive rather than something to die for if necessary. The room was completely silent now. Even Kethvar had sat back down, his confident expression replaced by a look of dawning understanding. The casualty rate of an Earth Marine, Professor Veltar said slowly, is 314%. This means that the average human Marine will be wounded severely enough to incapacitate any other galactic species over 3 times before they stop fighting. They do not stop fighting because they are killed. They stop fighting because their bodies have absorbed so much damage that even their impossible physiology can no longer sustain combat operations. A Zephyrian student in the second row raised a trembling hand. Professor, what does this mean for galactic security? If humans are as dangerous as you suggest, Veltar was quiet for a long moment before answering. It means that we should be very grateful that humans appear to be a peaceful species with no interest in military expansion. It means that our assumptions about primitive species and their military capabilities were dangerously wrong. He looked around the room at the shocked faces of his students, then turned his gaze to Sarah Chen. For the first time in days, she did not feel embarrassed or defensive about her species. It means, the professor continued, that the galaxy has underestimated Earth in ways that could have catastrophic consequences if we ever found ourselves in conflict with them. Kethvar spoke up, his voice much quieter than usual. But Professor, humans only have a few million soldiers total. Even if they are as effective as you say, surely they could not threaten major galactic powers. Professor Veltar smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. Cadet Kethvar, you are still thinking like a traditional military analyst. You are assuming that human military strength can be measured by counting soldiers and comparing equipment. He brought up one final image on the screen, a photo of human civilians working in weapons factories during one of their wars. Human military strength cannot be measured that way because humans do not separate their military and civilian populations during wartime. When humans fight a serious war, their entire society becomes a military force. Every factory, every citizen, every resource is directed toward the conflict until victory is achieved. The professor looked directly at Sarah Chen as he spoke his final words. The reason humans have such a small peacetime military is not because they are weak. It is because they do not need a large standing army. When humans decide to fight a war, they do not send their military to battle. They become a military. Sarah stood up slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon her. The room was so quiet she could hear the soft humming of the air circulation system. That is why we do not have a large military, she said simply, echoing the professor's words. We do not need one. The silence that followed her statement seemed to last forever. When Professor Veltar finally dismissed the class, students filed out without their usual chatter and conversation. Many of them looked at Sarah with expressions she had never seen before, a mixture of respect, fear, and careful consideration. Kethvar was the last to leave. As he passed Sarah's seat, he stopped and looked at her with his silver eyes that no longer held any trace of mockery. I apologize for my question, he said quietly.